So today we're continuing and we are concluding the discussion regarding bugs in the water that we began last week following an actual incident, a Ma'aseh Shahaya here in the Kolel. So the idea was, the premise is that we're trying to go through the foundations of the discussion, in particular based on what Rav Heller, maybe Shaloi b'chutz l'gidra, he went and was ma'ayin and matriach and misyagea in this sugya, and he wrote it up, as we said, in Samach Vav, then again in Ayin Beis, with some comparisons drawn to what some other Rabbanim also wrote about this at the time. So last week we began with the Yesod that comes before all the rest, which is things that are a question of things that are completely microscopic. And we, just to give a quick summary and overview, we said that the microscopic creatures were discovered essentially for the first time in history in the 1600s after the invention of the microscope. And already then, someone was already noting that there were teloim in the vinegar, and then things moved along over time until around the year 1800. The Sefer Rabbi was the first one to be ma'ir about it in a halachic context. And his maskana was that once you pour it into food, it has a din of parish, that when it's part of the vinegar, so it was still neilad b'talosh, so it's not a sharetz yet, but once it's parish from the vinegar into the food, according to the Sefer Rabbi, it's already parish, it's already a sharetz al haaretz. So the only solution, according to the Sefer Rabbi, was to first boil it in order to kill them off and then to filter them out. And then we went through some of the responses that the Sefer Rabbi received. So number one was the binas adam, the chayad, and chachmas adam. So who made 3 points? Number one, why did the Torah mention chaymet, never mentioned there's a problem? Number two, the Torah doesn't ask for things that are only b'koyach, not b'poil, although it seems that when he said that, he didn't quite fully understand what the nature of microscopic things are. He thought it was like the idea of like somehow seeing the potential chicken in the egg. And number three, even if you could see them, so no, that's a din in Paiskim that they're neilad b'talosh and they're not osir until they're paidish. And he goes with the shita that he has a very extreme definition of what paidish means, that it really has to leave the kli altogether before you give it a din padish. So Baal Teshaktu, they did, you're eating bugs, it's not a problem if you can't see it while you're eating it. So therefore he says no one ever had a problem with it, and he's not accepting this problem. The Mo'eri another sefer, the Malamakim of the Shraga writes a vart that it seems to him that these small creatures don't have any independent, they can't be paidish. The second they're paidish, they don't exist. They only exist within the kemach and the mayim, which also isn't necessarily exactly correct. And then we got to the B'Shleim McCluger. The B'Shleim McCluger said 2 points. Bedika is only shaykh to whatever a person is able to be baidik, but if it's b'derech rochik, that's not a bedika. He was talking for the guy by bedika to be match or something. And number two, the Siraya, what do you mean? There's bugs in the water, there's bumps on the shchita knife. We never paid attention. So from here we see, Bal Karchach, to the iya b'kli zu lav re'iyah. We don't call it a re'iyah. You saw it? No, you didn't see it. That's not re'iyah. So not lahachmer, not lahakol. So he didn't say that they don't exist, but he seems to be saying that the bedika is not a bedika, and the re'iyah is not a re'iyah. And we're only mechuyev to act, to do bedikas, to do re'iyahs, and to act according to those bedikas and re'iyahs, and this is not a bedika, not a re'iyah. Madam Shik, who was actually talking about bugs in the water, he said, of course, if there's a miyat hamotzu, you're supposed to check it, but from the Gemara and Shulchan Aruch, it sounds like that's not the case for water. And even if you say that there's some places that are more infested, but the way he says it is, if you're drinking by day and you can look and see if there are bugs, and if you don't see, you don't have to check any extra. So he introduces this line, and so also seemingly along the same lines, he's not really addressing the question as to their existence. He's just saying we have a certain chiyuv to check, and we're human beings, so we check in accordance with our abilities as human beings, not as malachim. You get to the Aruch HaShulchan in Yehudea Peidal, which is the simon, the relevant simon, and his line there is, what the eye can't see. And then he gives this, the eye, what about all the invisible things floating through the air every time you open your mouth? And he says, even if it's true, so he possibly goes the furthest he has this line here, Lav Klumu. So it almost sounds like he's saying Taka on the other side of the coin. That Taka Mitzat Torah, if you can't see it, maybe it's Taka not a thing b'chol. So however you say it, this has been, of course, accepted as a yesod in all kinds of shilas about things that might be possible if you look at them at a microscopic level. Sometimes people use this word as well when something comes into being on a microscopic level, even if later it grows and becomes visible. But we might use this word and say we don't look at it. If the question is what way did it come into being, we won't say that we look at it the way it came into being on the microscopic level. We might consider it to have appeared and come into being the second it became visible to our eyes. That's another way to use this idea. Now, before we continue, and of course, my main goal here is to get to the next point, which is the actual bugs in the water, which are, of course, are not, no one's claiming they're completely microscopic. I just want to address one more point. Seeming the light came over after the Shiur during the week to discuss a bit further. What is Taka, this gather? We keep on saying we ignore, we don't take into account things that are microscopic, things on this resolution. But what does that mean? What is Taka the Vart here? Right? You could explain it in different ways. Is it that's Pasha Taka, not a Metzius? We just claim it doesn't exist on any level as far as Torah is concerned? Or is it a din in this Isser maybe? Maybe the Gidrei HaIsser is that it has to be a Sheretz HaSheretz Al-Haaretz. And part of Sheretz HaSheretz Al-Haaretz is that you see it being Sheretz Al-Haaretz. So if you can't see it Sheretz Al-Haaretz, it's something else. It's not the thing the Torah was talking about. There'll be another way of explaining it. Or is it just a word in the Chi of Habadika, like some of these Mekaydos we just quoted, sound like that you have a Chi to be Baidik up to a certain extent. Past that, you don't have to be Baidik. We're not addressing so much what the actual thing is. You see in some Svarim, they bring a quote that the Torah B'chalal was given L'fi Chushei Ha'adam. The Torah only exists and plays out on the plane of normal human senses. Right? So what exactly does that mean? How does that work? And part of the problem here seemingly is that we don't have an ancient chashav makar that we can be medayek and say, Zoy, this is the exact gather of this Indian. Right? Because all we have essentially are a bunch of achreinim from the last 150 years. Now, of course, generally we rely on their psak. And especially in cases where it's basically impossible. We won't be able. When it comes to Elohim, it's basically impossible. There is no other option really. You can't be chayshish for every single microscopic being in the universe. And you have the stark raya b'chlal that if there was a problem, the Torah should have said something about it a long time ago. So we have that. And we're relying on their psak. We do rely on their psak, but can we mamish extract from what they say? Can we extract a klal, a yesodistic klal that applies to kol chelkei haTorah, even if it's not a case of a chash isser, what we just described? What if it's in other situations where there's something microscopic? Can we mamish? Do we have a clear makar that tells us punkt how we look at it? Lav dafka. So, Mashal, an example of this nafkamina would be recently I have a question of meat grown in a laboratory from stem cells. So what din does this product have? Does it have the din of meat? Does it have the din of behemoth toyer, behemoth tmeya, aver menachai, all of these questions? As a side note, it happens to be that in the last month or so, Dafka, there's been, after all the hype for years and years, they're coming out and saying that Lav Dafka, they ever see how they'll ever be able to actually create this at the scale and at a price point that's ever going to be financially viable. So it could be the whole thing is Hilchsel Mashiach. Not every hyped upcoming product ever comes to the market. But we're talking about it already for many years. Sir Tzvi Reisman likes to write about these types of things. So he wrote an article about this in one of the volumes of Tchumen that comes out every year with articles on halachic topics. So among the points he raised this idea that maybe because the meat when it starts out in the lab, you're starting out with microscopic cells. The cells themselves are completely invisible to the eye. So maybe al pi halacha that would mean that we're not miyachas it to its source because its source didn't exist al pi halacha. Came out of nowhere. So maybe it doesn't have the din of the meat, doesn't retain that din from the source.
But stem cells are from an actual cow.
Yeah, yeah. But then there were other Rabbanim who responded to his articles, and they didn't agree on many points. And one of the points they didn't agree with him on was on this point. Because maybe you could say, one way of saying would be that taka, it starts off microscopic, but then this cell itself replicates itself so much until it becomes visible again. And it's the same chaymer, it's the same material. It started off microscopic, and then it's not microscopic anymore, but it's still the same thing. So that's a way of making the argument that it never really lost its actual qualities. Just for a while, you couldn't see it. You could see it, and you couldn't see it, and you could see it again. It's still the same thing the whole time. Another point that's raised is mela when it comes to bugs. The whole part of bugs is we want to ignore it. We're not going to pay attention to it. We're not going to look at it. As far as we're concerned, no, it's not there. But when you're sitting in a laboratory and your whole job description in the laboratory is, what do? I sit and I look at microscopic things and I play around with microscopic things. So if that's your whole Sgan, that's your whole approach here, that means you are being machshivit. This is your line of work. You're being machshiv the microscopic. So in that field, in that tchum, that means that it does exist. And apparently, and then of course, ultimately it does reappear. And this is the quote of Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. Shlomo Zalman Auerbach was asked a similar question about kilayim. Right, you're playing around with, you're taking cells from one bria and you're mixing it, you're doing genetic engineering. All the genetic engineering is also happening on a very microscopic level. So does that mean that kilayim is fine? Shlomo Zalman said no, because you're dealing with these particles. So that means that for the purposes of this process, it is nidalei nayim. Can't compare it to bugs. Which thing? Tam. That's its own. I saw people touching on that as well. That's probably its own category, though. The tam, the pashtus, we believe that it's large enough that if you would see it, it would be visible. It's masked by the pot, but it's there. That's different than saying that on every single level, this is just a microscopic thing. We're not talking about minute microscopic amounts of flavor. We're talking about substantial amounts of flavor that are just not visible. I think it's different. Okay, that's its own discussion. But anyway, we see that it's far from being so simple and straightforward. It's not that there's a clear marker that says that everything that's microscopic doesn't exist on every level. It's not quite that simple. And of course, those interested can always be ma'ayin more. So getting back to the main question, which you want to talk about, assuming that you have to see something. Right, so to what extent do we say this? And as we started saying last week, if you see a small black dot without any other details, does that mean you see it? Or do you have to see that this is the shape of a bug? And once you enter this territory, then you discover that at this point, we already lose the complete agreement between poskim. You can already see the divergence. So I started saying this already last time, but we'll just start over again and go through the inyan. You look in Yisrael, that first issue from Samach Dalet, where most of those who wrote about it. So Chaim Oberlander, who put it before, he writes there that very often you see just a small dot, looks like dirt. With the magnifying glass, you can see that it's a sheret. So he says Rabbi, who's the famous Machmer, who wrote the Sefer B'dikas Amos and Kil Chasoy, so he quotes from Shlomo Zalman Auerbach as saying that that's enough. Just the fact that you see the dot means that it's visible and it's usher. So Oberlander responds and says, seems like it's a chiddush. What do you mean? When it eternal malachei hasharis. And before the magnifying glass was invented, what do you think happened? Of course, people ate it. So why should we suddenly change the halacha now? If the average person still doesn't see it, right? That should be the simple litmus test. What would have happened 200 years ago in this exact same situation? Right? Because sometimes there's plenty of discussions about telayim of different sizes in Sfarim for the last many hundreds of years. We don't lack for those discussions. So if they discussed it, that means that they have something to say. We'll see. They're machmed, they're mekel. But if it was non-existent to them, so that would probably be good proof that we should continue ignoring it. Then he quotes Shmei Shabbos Kol Chasa. I believe it's a quote from there, that this is actually a back and forth with Shlomo Zalman. When it comes to the aphids on the citrus fruit, so first here from Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, that if you can't reach a state that you can actually see the movement, the chayusan, that it's a living being, rechishasa, on the fact that it's moving, crawling. So then l'chayra, it's not in the category of sheretz hasheretz al aretz. It's the idea that we mentioned, that possibly especially didn't sheretz hasheretz. You have to see it. So even if Shlomo Zalman is thinking in this direction, and that's part of the gather of sheretz hasheretz. But then if Shlomo Zalman changed his mind, he said he heard that from the Chazon Ish that he was machmir about these particular aphids, and he heard that it depends on what phase of the aphid's life. Could be earlier on, it is more visible as a bug, or as the crawling is more visible, and then later they just stop crawling. So that's why he wasn't sure the halacha about those. But you see, b'chlolos from Shlomo Zalman, that in order for it to be a problem, you do have to be able to see bug-like activity. You have to get the sense from looking at it, oh, this looks like a bug. And if not, if it's just a dot, then it should be fine. That's even seeing the movement, never mind identifying it as a sheretz at all. I mean, it probably depends on the situation. In some cases, it's probably easier to tell that it's a sheretz, and in some cases, it's easier just to notice the movement. But either way, and then he quotes the Shevet HaLevi, who's the big mocker, that one quotes, it says that, they have thousands of dots everywhere, and there's no difference between those dots and regular dots, and those regular dots are not a chash sheretz. You're going to tell me that 500 dots that look like this are not a chash sheretz, and 500 dots look like that are a chash sheretz. You go with your eye. Ultimately, you're always going to get bogged down in an argument in each case as to what the metzias is. Who? I don't know if he was asked about strawberries. Again, I don't know what, it could be each Rav will come to a different conclusion about the metzias as to what the visibility actually is anyway. Or they'll just say that's be machmer because we don't know. That's part of the question, which Rabbi Heller is going to touch on in a second, is you generally don't actually know how you're going to be able to decide this strawberry it is visible, and that strawberry it's not visible. So, but right now we're speaking in Inyan. In Inyan, if it's not visible, it's just a dot, it should be fine. So then we said, Rav Oberlander concluded, Legabe these bugs in the water, that in his mind, to his perception, these look to a regular eye as dirt, as dust. No one thinks of them as bugs, even under the light. But it seems like they were already there for many years before anybody noticed them. So that should be pretty good proof that no one identified them as bugs in their water. And it's only the external tools, the magnifying glass, that's being moiled the problem, not the naked eye. And that was his own impression when he checked it, he said. So he was ready to start saying maybe it's not a problem. But then he heard from the Askanim that in Bar Park, right, over there, they saw them. So, okay, if you say you saw them, that's a different story. And also, they argue that really they were visible to begin with. Then the chemicals are put in the water, so then they shrink, then you can't see them anymore. But really, the issue started when they were visible. So that was why he didn't want to be makel based on this idea. All right, so we said Rav Heller also starts off touching on this, and he says, you see in Shulchan Aruch, Bechlal, the gather by Shratz and Bechlal is that it's not a sheretz, it's called Zman Shel Erichashu. One of the main opinion is that you have to see some movement. Other Rishonim say, even Chayas Ba'alma, if you see that it's a living thing. And that's not even a din Lagabe seeing, that's just Bechlal, what's the gather of a sheretz. So Heller connects the two things and says that the same way it's Shein Angenom, we've accepted you have to see the sheretz itself. So when we say that the sheretz has to either be visibly alive or visibly moving, that also has to be visibly lying. That's the word of Shlomo Zalman, and that's the word of the Shevet HaLevi. The problem still will be, how will you ever decide this? What rules are we going to make now? We don't actually know in each case what it is visible, it's not visible. So that takes you into the Miyat HaMatzoi territory, which is its own discussion. Hopefully we'll touch on it briefly at the end today. So you brought a word from the base of Ephraim that when you have a miyat hamatzah and you're checking for teloim, that's only if you know for sure that the teloim are teloim. The question is if they're here. But if there's a suffix on the sheretz itself, it's a suffix sheretz, then tzveika l'kula. Rabbi points out there's a taz, and often a taz in Simon Pedal, that says, that the Shulchan Aruch says, that if you know the bugs come when it's mechuber, which of course is much worse, so Shulchan Aruch says you have to check. So the taz is medaik. So if it's only masliya b'talosh, so that means that it's only going to become aser if it's pidesh. Right? It's also right away. B'talosh, it's only aser la'achas pidesh. So that means you have a suffix on the ganze sharetz because you never know if it was piresh or not. So it's a suffix sharetz, so you don't have to check for suffix sharetz. So this idea, we can apply that here as well. What's the suffix over here? The suffix over here, which it might also be if it was piresh, but the suffix we're talking about is we don't know if it moved or not. Is it a moving sharetz that's visible to the eye, then it's a sharetz, or is it not? So I always have the suffix, so it could be we could use this as a word to say we don't have to check.
If a little black dot is swimming and you see it moving around, you don't actually see that it's a bug. On one hand, you can see that it's
right.
moving.
Like I said, in some cases it's easier to see the movement. In some cases, it's probably easier to see the fact that it's a bug. The question is movement without seeing that it's a bug. I mean, dirt also moves in your cup. That's the nature is that things are moving. So Rabbi Heller concludes this portion of his discussion that if you don't know for sure that it moved, that could already be enough of a reason to not require bedika l'rabim for small dots that you don't see the telas or the chayes. The question still is, what exactly is the metzias here legabe the water? What is this water, these bugs, the copepods? How visible are they? So let's take a look what some others wrote. Right, Rabbi started off by saying he thought they were not particularly visible. They were basically dots. Then he said, but the others told him that they are. So in the same issue, there's also an article by Rav Shlomo Gross of Belza and Borough Park. He starts off by quoting the Shevet HaLevi, and he frames it already. The Chiddush Gadol, the Shevet HaLevi says, Chiddush Gadol, that dots are fine. He says, he responds right away by saying, in this case, it's not relevant because we saw, and we checked again, and it was Nisames Lonu B'Re'iyas Ha'ayin Greda, that these are shratzim, and you can see the raglayim, and you can see the karnayim, you can see the bug-like characteristics. So it's all mamash B'Re'iyas Ha'ayin, that it's not psailas, but shratzim. So it's asurim l'chol hadayas. And even if you take the Shevet HaLevi, that's not relevant here. And but anyway, he then concludes by saying that he's not even makabel the Shevet HaLevi's chiddush lahalacha. So you see, and he's probably not the only one. So you see that there isn't even a complete consensus about this idea that the dots are not a problem. There are some that would, I should say, like Rabbi also. It seems like Rabbi and that school of thought holds that if the dot is visible, that basically means that you have to check with the magnifying glass. So that's part of the debate here. And then there's also a debate over the metzias as to how visible these actual bugs in the water are. Now, part of the question here is also, let's say if it's there and you look really carefully, maybe you could identify it. The question would still be, maybe it's sufficient to just take a quick look and to see if something jumps out at you right away. And that's what's mashma from the Madam Shik, because Madam Shik made it sound like if you're drinking by day in a cup where you can see clearly, and you can see if there's a bug or not. If you don't see, leit sarach bedika tfei shema yesh b'toila she'eni nere. But the Eisrim, like the Rav Gross, I think, or maybe one of the other ones in that Rabbi, the name of Rabbi Stritsky, they say that no. It must be Madam Shik was talking about some other kind of creature that happened to be, and that creature was very easy to see. And if you didn't see that, you knew you were good to go. But today, when we know that the creature in question is a little trickier to see and to identify, Avada, the Chiv Abedika goes further because you can see throughout the Paiskim, the history of the discussions in Allah over Teilaim, there's plenty of cases where they made it sound like you have to look carefully. Here's how you should look, do this, do that. So where would this idea come from that you just take a quick look? But Rav Heller, after he already established the previous point, so then he goes on to another question of what if they're not really visible quite where they are right now? He starts off talking about peiros, and he says that if it's never visible on the fruits, in order to see, you could see it, but in order to see it, you first have to do something else. You have to soak it in water and separate it in water. So Rabbi Eliezer says that does not have a din sharetz. So he says, and then he concludes, Lefi zeh hu adin gam b'sharetz hamayim. Kol zman shleim nikar b'toich hamayim lechashav sharetz. So if there's, to some extent, you would say that it's not really something you would see by looking at the water. You have to filter it first. After filtering it, then it suddenly comes into your vision. You're able to see it, comes into view. So as long as it's, when you look at the water normally, you wouldn't see. You have to do something else in order to see it. Weiter, he still hasn't fully clarified what he thinks the actual metzias here is precisely with these bugs in the water, right? Because those who say that it's usher, they seem to be saying, "Oh, it's very visible. You don't need a filter. You don't need to do anything." Anyway, now we get to the main chiddush of Rabbi Heller. This is what I've heard also from others who are familiar with the sugya, familiar with what he wrote. That this is like the crowning argument that Rabbi Heller makes. It's based on what he found in a sefer called Minhagei Maharash. Who's the Maharash? The first Maharash. So Minhagei Maharash is one of the works of the late Rishonim of Ashkenaz, who lived at the end of the 1300s and the beginning of the 1400s. And just a side historical note. Even though we know that Yidden overall lived in Ashkenaz continuously, more or less, with some strong, major traumatic events, but they were never quite expelled from Ashkenaz. But it actually turns out that if you want to trace the Shalsheles HaTorah, you can see there's actually like on times and off, on and off. There's breaks in Torah activity in Germany. So, for example, at the end of the period of the Bali HaTosfos and the Hasidei Ashkenaz, Yehuda Chassid and the Lekeach, which is the beginning of the 1200s. So between that and between Maram Rottenberg and his Talmidim, so those who've researched it notice that there's actually like a missing generation there in the middle. And then Avada afterwards, it's even clearer that after the Ma'aseh of Maram Rottenberg, at the end of the 1200s, and then the Rosh fleeing Germany in 1303, there's also a gap, there's a break in Torah. And then at the end of the second half of the 1300s, then you see another generation of Gedolei HaTorah. But each time this happens, if you pay attention, you can notice that there's like a yesh, ayin, yesh type of situation. And the tzura of the Torah that comes afterwards is like a totally different tzura than what came before. It's not a hamshich. So what happened then? So from that kufa, the end of the 1300s, beginning of the 1400s, so the most famous one is the Maharil. Maharil is the Talmud of these Gedolim from the end of the 1300s. Maharil's Chavers of Isaac Turner, those are two names you hear a lot. Their Rabbeim that sort of restarted the Torah in Germany proper are Rabbi Avram Kleisner and Reb Shalom Neustadt, who themselves were actually in Austria, not in Germany proper. In the last few decades, Machon Yerushalayim, Mifal, Teres Chachmei Ashkenaz, so they published all of these chiburim, Minhagei Rabbi Avram Kleisner, Minhagei Marash, Neustadt, Minhagei Maharil, Minhagei Rabbi Isaac Turner, and then you're able to sort of get a picture as to the Torah at this time. And when you look in the Ramah and Shulchan Aruch, everyone knows that Ramah brought Torah's Ashkenaz, the Psak of Ashkenaz, into Shulchan Aruch. So a tremendous percentage of it comes from this group of Svarim. So anyway, that's just to give some concept of Minhagei Marash, even though it's not a household name, but it's dafka essentially very chashuv. And of course, Rabbi Heller wants you to agree with that because it's very central to the point he's about to make. So in Minhagei Marash, Minoishtat Siman Tov Samach Dalet, it says that there was a chacham by the name of Merkel, Reb Merkel. And he asked Reb Shalom, the Marash, about a be'er shenimtza by teiloim be'im ketanim, and then there are some unclear words over here. It says like tziva, palsa, or something like that. So Reb Eller says l'chayre tziva is tzeva, the color, and plasa is like blas. Like in Yiddish today, blas means pale. So l'chayre means that they were of a very pale color, which is very much like what we're talking about in the scenario today. Machon Yerushalayim, I think, just says, not sure what these strange words are, and they leave it at that. But it seems like a reasonable interpretation, perhaps. I think it's common in these Sifrei Ashkenaz, sometimes you have these mysteriously written words. And it says, Ve'enam nirim ela b'shas richas hashemesh. Also fits with that. You can only see it when the sun is shining directly into it. So his Talmud asked him, what's the story? And his Rebbe, Reb Shalom, told him, you're allowed to drink from that be'er. The question was regarding a well. You're allowed to drink from that be'er. Ein lachash le'isser. And you can even rinse other things with it. Not a problem at all. B'lei chayshinon ki heter gomer yesh b'zeh ha'be'er, like every other be'er. That's all it says. But seemingly a pretty direct question about a situation that sounds like our situation. Like we said, there's been discussions about Teiloim for the last many hundreds of years. And generally, it seems that even if it's only visible in the sun, it seems overall, and in Manhag Marash, they write on the bottom, Tarichim, since when is that the standard? That if you only see it in the sun, it's fine. If there's just good light, that should be enough to be machmer, to aser. So Rabbi comes along and creates from this makar a ganze Torah. There's a special din in Sheretz Hamayim. He says, Marash Kamash Malon, a special din in Torah Hamayim. That if you can't tell the difference between the sheretz and the mayim, loy b'mara, by looking at it, loy b'mishmash hayad, you also won't be able to feel it if you just stuck your hand in. Ein loy shem u'metzias b'fnei atzma. It has no independent existence al pi Torah. V'arehu b'chlal mayim l'chol dinei Torah. We just consider it like water. So that means that if it's mixed in the water and they're not noticeable, then the kuli alma will be mashlim shir mem so be mashlim the shir nevias from the tilas yadayim. And even if you know, based on other external information, that the water is full of these teilayim, you don't have to filter them because they're bottled to the water and they have shei mayim. And it's no worse than the halacha that's already established about dirt in the water. The dirt in the water is mashlim the shir. What's the pshat? So he quotes the Alter Rebbe in the Tilas Yadayim Siman Kuf Samach when it comes to Shinui Mara, which is another issue you could have with foreign substance in the water. So the word there is that the Ein Mara offer Chashav Shinui Mara B'Hamayim because Gidul Hamayim Hu B'Offer V'Tit. Water comes along, you take a scoop of water, there's likely to be a certain percentage of dirt, particles, etc. in the water. That's the nature of water, that it has some extraneous stuff in it, and that's still what we call water as a whole. And for that reason, we would say, Taka, that that's why it's even mashlim the shear of water. Mamish acquires all the properties of water. The Metzias is mispatel hamayim, it has the Metzias shel mayim, and not even just a din mayim, linyan shear memsod. Mamish Metzias shel mayim. Compares it to shmorim, drugs in the wine. If you take them out, if you isolate them, it's not wine, but if it's in the wine, it's mashlim ashir revius. There's also the bran in the flour. If you make a dough out of bran itself, it's not lechem. But if it's in the flour, it's mashlim ashir kazayas. So you see these concepts in different places. She says, the sheretz hamayim is no worse than offer v'tit. It has sheimayim through the mixture, and even if you could filter them out, they're still bottled and they have sheimayim aleim because they grow there and they're always there and they mix in it very well. So by bazai we can extend that to achila as well, that has sheimayim. It's visible to the sun in the sunlight. That's not enough. And he's mitzayin to a similar question in the Shalos of Shuvas Dovid Misharim that Shabiner. Mentioned them once before. The Dovid Misharim Chelik Aleph and Simon Yud Zayin was asked about rainwater from the roof for a mikveh, and on the way down, it's normal rainwater; it shouldn't have a color, but there's something yellow on the roof somewhere along the way, and it gets yellowish as it flows down from the roof. So in the next, he discusses it there, and then the next one he says that I already saw. Apparently, they brought him a specimen, an actual jar of the water. And when I saw it, it looks like Maya Mamish. How did you even have a question? What you did was, you did a comparison. You took a bowl of this, a cup of this, and you took a cup of normal rainwater straight from the sky, and then you notice the difference. That's not enough of a difference. And there's a Magen Avram in Hilchos Esrig. It says in Shulchan Aruch that from the Chaitim and on, then Kol Shinei Mare is Paisel B'Kosher. The Magen Avram says, Shinei Mare, Dafke Kishenere Lehedya L'Roif Bnei Adam. Brings this word from the Mabit that in this case it has to be clearly visible to most people. That's when it comes to things that are totally b'mare. So Bazai, the same thing here. Most people just see the water; they won't notice anything. You have to go out of your way and check and compare. That's not a problem. So Rabbi El is making a tzushtel and saying it's the same thing, that the sunlight in this case. The sunlight is just showing you something that you really wouldn't see. We see Achreinim were machmer in water in other situations. So either that was other flies that fell in, nothing to do with the creatures that dwell in the water, or they were talking about ones that are taka very noticeable, or it's a situation in which there was Peidish and then it went back in. Then you have to get into that discussion. But he concludes, Leis atal mitzasi mi shiyach like a maharash. Then he adds another point, that addresses the argument that, oh, really, they were visible to the chemicals. He says, if in the be'er, the terloim are not nicker without special sunlight, so we already established in the Marash that you're allowed to drink directly from the be'er, because as long as it's not nicker, it doesn't have shem sheretz. So when it's still there, and then you put the chemicals in, and then they shrink, so that means they never had a shem sheretz. If the chemicals are entered at this stage, where al pi halacha, according to Marash, you could still drink directly from the be'er because it's not visible to a regular person in a regular situation, and then you put in the chemicals, and then it shrinks it, and then it becomes invisible b'chal, so then it never had the shem sheretz in the first place. If it was the first had it din sheretz, and then you shrank it, so that's their argument. He's saying never had a shem sheretz to begin with. He just explained this whole mahalach. The question, though, still is, what is considered visible? Right? In this case, like you said, dafka, the movement was more visible than the actual tzura sheretz. So it's v'tzara chiyah. But he says, as long as it's only something that's visible in special light, it should be a heter gomer according to Maharash. He concludes that, and that's if you can mamish see something. But if you can only see dots, then it's even better. And if you need extra training, but a normal person would identify them even in the sun as dots, so then limit sasi b'shum paisik without aser, in places where it's not even little dots. So it seems like, even though he doesn't say fully clearly, it sounds like this is where he thinks he's describing the Metzias, his version of the Metzias, as to how visible these creatures actually are. Now he goes on to talk about other things. We have to conclude, and we'll leave the topic at that. It touches on other things. The mashal. Let's say it's usher only when it's peidish. It's a sheretz hamayim. So the question is, once it's peidish, is it because it's now a sheretz hamayim, or when it was in the water, it didn't have a sheretz, it didn't sheretz hamayim. When it's peidish, it then becomes a sheretz hashayretz halaretz. If you say that, and apparently most Rishonim say that, then if it can't survive outside of the water, that means it never has the gather of sheretz hashayretz halaretz. And here we get to the big question, which is that the halacha is that shratzim in the oceans and the rivers, natural springs, etc., they are osir mishum sheretz hamayim right away, similar to the talosh mechuber idea. So then it's also right away. If it's in a bar, then it's mamish not moving at all. So then it's mamish not, it doesn't have a din sheretz hamayim, and only once it leaves, the mainstream view is that then it becomes a sheretz halaretz. The question is, what about the charitzin hamoishkim? You have some kind of concentration of water that moves to some extent, but it's not a natural body of water. That's where the question is going to be, and that's where a huge discussion of the water here as well comes into that. Chaim Oberlander and his essay seem to be more to say that based on his understanding of the reservoirs and the rivers and the rainwater and the pipes, and it gets very, very exciting. Lots of Rabbanim went down personally on boats on tour of the reservoir to figure out exactly what's going on there. Is it a din charetz? Is it a din bar? Which stage were the shratzim noilad? You'll have different opinions, min hakatza, lakatza. So that's, we're not getting into that befratis, but that's another important aspect of the discussion. And then we only have 1 minute left, but part of the discussion is also about miyat hamatzah. B'chlal, when it comes to miyat hamatzah, there's a big machlekes. The way it's usually given is the Rivash says miyat hamatzah is close to half, 49%. That's already a miyat hamatzah. The Mishkanis Yaakov, many hundreds of years later, says that it's 1 out of 10. If it's 1 out of 10, it's already a miyat hamatzah. How does he get that? We're not getting into the pratim. The question is, every hechsher has to make a decision. What do we consider miyat hamatzah? So there's a big range. Some might say taka, we should be more make like the Rivash. Some would say we should be machal the Mishras Yaakov. Some would be machal even more. He says, Rabbi says that even if it's mamish, very small, but if you know consistent that it's there, we have, klari yediyas, we know what's going on, then even that would be a miyat hamatzah. So anyway, Rabbi Heller says that practically when you have houses, every house is its own story. You can't say miyat hamatzah and the other house affects this house. Every house has its own gather. And even in a house itself, you're supposed to filter, especially if you see that there might be a problem. But if you can't filter based on all the different issues you raised, it's not the end of the world, and that's what apparently many are being semech on when it comes to this halacha. Have good chance. Yeah.